Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or add our RSS feed to your podcatcher of choice. You can also follow us on Twitter or Google+, with links in the show notes. And please give us feedback. Leave us a review on iTunes, send us a tweet, send us an email, or leave a message on Google+. You can also leave comments on our show notes. Feedback helps people find the podcast so that other people can enjoy it as much as you have. I'd also like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. I would also like to thank Hired, a job marketplace for developers, for sponsoring this episode of podcast.init. Use the link hired.com/podcastinit to double your signing bonus. Linode is also sponsoring us this week. Check them out at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $10 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for your next project. We are recording today on October 12th, 2015, and your hosts as usual are Tobias, Macey, and Patti. Today we're interviewing Anthony Scopatz on Xonsh. Anthony, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Tobias, and thanks, Chris. I'm a new faculty member at the University of South Carolina, which is currently not as much underwater as it was last week, so thank you for small miracles there. And I'm a nuclear engineer, a nuclear engineering professor, so I'm in the mechanical engineering department here. And I've come from a physics background and have been involved in the Python scientific computing community for a long time, and that's about where I am.
That's great. How did you get introduced to Python?
Well, a python killed my mother. No.
Prepare to die.
Yeah. So, yeah, that went to a dark place. So I actually got introduced to Python through Portage. So on Gen 2, the package manager was my first introduction to Python, and that was 2001 or so. So I sort of just arrived at 2002, I guess. So I just arrived at college as an undergrad and was fooling around with computers a lot. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of where I learned the shell and learned Python and everything. I learned a few good languages in that time period, and everything else I've seen has just not really been up to snuff.
That's a very interesting standpoint on it, because there definitely are plenty of languages out there, and I have to agree that Python is the one that I find most comfortable to work with. So it's interesting that you have found so many of them to be lacking.
Yeah, exactly. It's not categorically true. There are other languages that I find interesting. Something from the functional world, maybe like Haskell is cool. Lua is a neat little language that I like for a lot of reasons, but if you're talking about languages like Bash and C++ and JavaScript and Java and sort of the other big heavy hitters that are out there today, none of them really give me that kind of expressiveness that I demand.
I think part of the appeal for Python is because of the fact that it does such an excellent job of fulfilling multiple paradigms, whereas a number of other available languages are a little bit more limited in the ways that they can be used or the ways that you can use them to think about the problem you're trying to solve.
Right.
Or the ways that their communities have enabled them to be used. If you know what I mean, like Ruby has a tremendous amount of tooling and library support if you're writing web apps or if you're writing infrastructure as code stuff, but maybe not so much for writing GUIs or doing scientific work, just as an example.
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that the ecosystem is what keeps me in Python at this point. 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I started, the ecosystem wasn't necessarily there. And so I've gotten to see a lot of that get built up over time, and that's been just a real blast. And it's been really great to see that happen.
So can you explain what Xonsh is and your motivation for creating it?
Sure. So Xonsh actually comes out of this exact issue, right? So I was writing a lot of Bash at my old job, or doing a lot of Bash and sort of CMake stuff for build systems, and I just realized that there had to be a better way than what Bash was doing. So that kind of set the stage for really thinking sort of very critically about what shells get used for and what they're actually good at and what they're not good at. And then back in February or so, I was writing I wrote a book with my lovely co-author, Katie Huff. It's called Effective Computation in Physics. You can go and you can look it up. It's by O'Reilly. They put it out. So thank you very much to O'Reilly for letting us publish that. But Katie had written the Bash chapter. So chapter 1 is all about Bash. And I was reviewing this chapter on Bash, going over it. And I got to the end of the chapter and I realized we hadn't even covered the sorts of things that you would cover in a normal programming language. Like, there was nothing about flow control. There was nothing about data types. There aren't really data types in Bash. There's a couple, but nothing worth noting. But instead we went over a lot of like this arcane syntax that people sort of only have to use for Bash. And so at that point, it really clicked that, hey, I can do this better, right? Like, what if we just had Python and Bash together, like the good parts of both and the bad parts of Bash removed?
That's really interesting. You hit on something there in that I've actually been doing some more in-depth work with Bash recently myself, and for a language that is perceived as to be simple, it actually has quite a bit of surface area that you need to be mindful of if you're going to use anything more than really basic sort of procedural batch language capabilities in it, right?
Right. Who knows how to like do a case statement in Bash off the top of their heads, or like the 3 different ways to define a function, or even for loops are super annoying, and if statements, it's really bad from a language design standpoint. It's really bad. You have to give them credit. It's a super old language, and it's got all this cruft, and it's been built up over, decades. So it's obviously successful.
And the majority of use, at least in my experience, for using Bash is just as a way of gluing together multiple other ancillary programs like awk and sed and grep. And like you said, trying to actually remember any of the specific features of Bash for doing anything beyond just piping those things together, like for loops or if statements. I just have to look it up every single time because it's just so obscure in relation to the ways that those things are defined in most of the other higher level languages like Python or Ruby or Java, just anything.
I mean, it's literally like you're casting spells, right? You have to remember these weird like somatic movements and put them into the keyboard, and it's very arcane.
So for people transitioning to Xonsh from a shell like Bash or Xeesh, what are some of the biggest differences that they will see?
Hopefully that transition is easy. So that's one of the things that I set out to do with Xonsh, was to make it so that it interfaces with Bash and Z shell and can pull the environment and aliases from those places. So that's one thing that Xonsh does that's a little different, is that it has sort of knowledge of other shells in a way that most shells don't. And then I think just the big difference is that you can use Python syntax everywhere. So, I mean, it's a Python superset language. So anything that's in Python goes. And this is true. We just released this today, actually, out into the wild. Python 3.5 is now fully supported. So just go at it, have fun. So that does a couple things for you, right? So the sort of really naive thing that you might want to do is just simple arithmetic. Like, this is super annoying in other shells. But once you have that, you can also start doing things like, importing libraries and calling different functions from those libraries, and, using those to string up these higher order complex operations. You can define functions in a way that makes sense, and just all of the stuff that's in Python you can now do in your shell. The other thing that I think that's significantly different is a notion. We have a really structured notion of history, and we have an optional capability where you can actually store all of your standard out and standard error along with your just the normal standard in and return values and things like that. So if you're in this sort of scientific computing space where you want to have perfect, complete memory of what you did, last month, that's something that you can do in Xonsh natively without having to think twice about it. And from there, there's other cool history things that you can do. You can, very easily use those as their scripts by replaying history, or you can diff two histories to see, you can take a history that was built on one machine, replay it on another machine, diff them and see kind of what was different and what's causing problems and things like that. So there's a lot of sort of features there that aren't in these other languages.
And so one thing that brings up is for cases where the standard out stream is particularly large, is there a way to limit the amount of output that actually gets stored in that history file so that you don't end up ballooning it to an enormous size?
Yeah, so there's a fully, that's all customizable. There's a garbage collector that gets run every time you start up Xonsh. So if you want to limit your total history stored to some value, you can. And I think the default is something like around 8,000 commands, 8,128 commands. But you can instead store that by, gigabyte, or you can limit that by, number of files, or a lot of other options, or how long ago the history was created, things like that.
Very cool. So when I ask this, I'm not necessarily asking you to recite them, but I'm just asking you to give us, our listeners, a sense. What are some powerful, really powerful one-liners that showcase Xonsh's capabilities?
Yeah. So since you can do a lot of cool Python things, so one of the cooler things that you can do is you can define aliases with Lambda functions. I mean, you can define aliases in Xonsh with any function, but you can also define them with lambdas. So you can define an alias with a lambda, add it to the aliases dictionary, and then immediately execute it if that's something that you wanted to do. I mean, other cool things is that we have a distinction between sort of a captured subprocess and an uncaptured subprocess. So Xonsh kind of executes subprocesses in these two modes. So the uncaptured one is like if you're just sitting there typing away, echo hello, and it'll spit something back out at you. But there's also just a Python expression that you can use, $ parentheses, just like in Bash, to grab that as a string. And then once you have this, shell executed, subprocess executed thing as a string, you can do whatever you want with it. So say you have, like a JSON file that you're curling, you can curl that directly, capture it, and then use, JSON.load to load it right into a Python dictionary as a single expression.
Yeah, that's really kind of neat. So if you're interacting with APIs that you're not entirely sure of, I can see that as being a really neat way to support kind of an iterative style of, sucking a blob of response from the server and then sort of say, transform it into JSON and parse it that way. And like you said, sort of see whether a dictionary makes sense or some more complex data structure all on the fly. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to make your life easier, right? I think a lot of tools. So there's a lot of other ones out there that I'm sure people have come up with that I'm not aware of, but sort of those are the ones that are kind of fun to me.
Do you folks have any place where this kind of thing is collected? Is there a sort of Xonsh brag page? Here, now you've installed Xonsh, here are some of the really cool things you can do kind of thing?
Not yet. There definitely should be. I would really love it if there was something like that. So very early on we got requests for a conch or oh my conch shell or whatever kind of capability where people could share those one-liners or those tools that they've built. I haven't built that out yet. I'd be really interested if someone wanted to do that. That'd be awesome. So 100% support that, but we could also just have a landing page, like you said.
Yeah, I definitely think that having sort of a list of available modifications that people have made so that other people can pick and choose what would be most useful for them would be really valuable because, while it is Python and you can customize it in whatever way you can possibly dream of using Python, it is useful to have something to spur those ideas when you're first getting started out with it to say, oh, well, I didn't even think about being able to do this with that.
Right. Yeah. No, it's cool. It's a good idea.
So what is it about Python that lends itself to this kind of a project, and what are your thoughts on building something like Xonsh in another language such as Ruby or Node.js?
That's a good question. So I think Python lends itself to this kind of thing because in part that's sort of what its original goal was in some sense. So Guido has some quote about, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but he has some quote about having written Python to make systems programming and scripting easier for people, right? And his kind of like, if I recall correctly, he had this sort of librarian use case in mind when he set out to do a lot of this stuff. And in a lot of ways, I think Python, the core Python kind of failed at that because it became this general purpose programming language. So it wasn't confined to its original shell, shall we say. And so because the things that you need to do to make something in a shell are somewhat incompatible with what you want in a general programming language. And so it takes this other project to come in and fill that role. And, I think Conch is the answer. I'm actually surprised no one had done it before, in some sense. It might have seemed too hard, but it actually didn't really take me that long to get a first cut that was fully working. So, and I'm 100% in support of people doing this for other languages. I think it's actually a good idea, because I don't think there's anything necessarily special about the shell use case that would kind of force a new language on people. Node.js might be interesting because it has it's got this asynchronous implementation. It's my understanding. I don't do a lot of Node stuff, but I mean, it would be cool to see how people resolve those issues there. And there is someone who is doing, who has an OCaml sort of idea that came out in the past couple of months. So I'll try to look that up and send you that for the show notes. But yeah, I think it's a good idea. Your shell should not get in the way of you programming. And so if your native language is Python or Ruby or C++ or whatever, you should be able to have a fully fledged shell in that language.
I have to confess, the idea of a Node.js shell kind of makes me shiver. Like the event driven and callback driven shell programming just seems like it might make my brain hurt a little bit. But who knows? I don't really know Node, so perhaps I'm casting it in an unfair light.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of that's why I think there'd be a lot of issues to resolve there. How you express those things, but good luck to whoever does it. I'm out. I'm done.
So, if you had to single out one killer feature that Xonsh brings to the table, what would that be?
Yeah. So if I had to say, I think it is just that, it is Python, and the shell stuff is exactly what you would expect from a shell language. So you don't have to say, not to pick on IPython, but you don't have to open up IPython to do the kinds of things that you need to do. Or you don't need to go into a Python shell to do and then import subprocess and do a bunch of subprocess manipulation, which can get tedious if you're doing it for, many, many, many calls. So the real killer feature is that it takes care of all of that stuff for you. And it lets you get straight to the task at hand, whatever that task is.
And so is it possible to specify which shell, such as Bash or Xonsh, gets used in subprocess mode?
So no subprocess is a shell unless you tell it to be, or is a foreign shell like Bash or Z shell. We're literally using subprocess under the covers. So subprocess does a system call. It doesn't make a call to another shell and then run that in its own shell. Okay. It just goes out to the operating system and says, hey, run this. So Bash and Z shell aren't really present for anytime you're in subprocess mode. It's just a straight up system call or operating system call.
And as a corollary to that, what does the migration path look like for somebody moving from Bash or Xonsh or Fish to Xonsh and who want to try and keep the different customizations that they've already made to their existing shell environment while still being able to leverage the power of Xonsh?
Yeah, so we've tried to make that easy. I'm sure there's still hiccups here and there, but so there's a couple different things that people worry about. So the first is sort of the setup stuff that you talked about. Like, I've got thousands of aliases, and my bash RC is huge, and it's got all these environment settings. I don't want to rewrite that just to try your code out. And so, as of 0.2.1, Xonsh allows you to specify an arbitrary number of what we call foreign shells, like Bash or Z shell or Fish, and that it will, on startup, take the environment and aliases from. And so it just runs a subprocess of that shell, steals out the environment and the aliases, and then returns and applies that to the environment that Xonsh is going to use. So the default is just to use Bash, but you can change that default if you need to. The other thing that people really worry about in migrating is if you need to source a foreign shell script. So this happens in Bash a lot, where even pip or virtualenv does this when you want to go, and conda does this when you want to activate an environment. You have to source this other file. And so what we have is we have an alias that you can use that will source the environment from a shell that's in another language. So, and aside from that, the migration is actually pretty easy, right? Because you can always run Bash from within Xonsh, or, the language is much simpler, and arguably you already know it. So if you need to port over a bunch of if statements and functions and stuff, it actually ends up looking a lot nicer and is a lot shorter in the long run. So kind of the migration story.
And so I started using the Xonsh shell as my daily terminal recently, and I've been enjoying it so far. And one of the things that I've been wondering is how to hook into the completion system to provide LDOC-style completion from parsing the output of help flags. And I'm wondering if you have any advice on where to start. And one thing that I thought as a possibility is using the docopt library to handle parsing of that help output to generate completions from that.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So this is on our to-do list in some sense, although contributions welcome. So there's a couple different ways to hook in. So we have a completer class, so that could always be extended. Something that we do actually also is that we are able to incorporate any Bash completion files, and that happens automatically. So if you have Git's Bash completion stuff installed, no one's going to rewrite that. So we just, when you hit tab to tab complete, and it's a Git command, it'll actually go and make a Bash complete call to pull the possible completions out. And something that we've wanted to do for a while is to be able to have an interface that's written in pure Python. You register some functions, and it goes ahead and executes and finds the possible completions. But and if anyone wants to tackle that, they're more than welcome to.
And so one complication I actually ran into recently of trying to use some Bash completion files on my system was, at least a couple of versions ago, I was trying to add some Bash completions, and there was a particular function definition for have that was being called in some of those files that didn't exist in my environment. And so I was trying to figure out how to define that function before the Bash completions were getting resolved, and wasn't quite able to figure that out, although part of that might have been due to a bug that got fixed in the most recent releases that you just made today, and yesterday, actually.
Yeah, probably not, sadly. So the Bash completion stuff kind of runs in its own little environment. But yeah, I mean, you'd have to probably go and make sure that the Bash completion function, this is getting into the weeds, but the Bash completion files that you're sourcing, I mean, this might be a way to do it, is to add another element to the Bash completions environment variable that has whatever functionality you need to make sure that it's there.
Part of my problem might have been that I wasn't sourcing the bash completion file. It was SC bash completion / bash completion, I think was what it was. So I probably wasn't sourcing that early enough, and that might have been what was leading to my issues.
We're a new project. I have great faith that all this stuff will get resolved in time, but we'd love the help in the short term to really build out the pieces and the capabilities of things that people want sooner rather than later.
And we've touched on this a little bit, but how do bash function definitions interoperate with the Xonsh environment and functions that are defined in Python?
We don't currently have the capability of having Xonsh run generic bash functions like Python functions. That could be added. It wouldn't be terrible to do that. It wouldn't be that hard. It wouldn't be that many lines of code, I'll say. And so that's one way. I mean, if you write a bash function and then use that in a bash script that then you source, like, that's all fine. But just having them appear magically in the Python context, that doesn't happen yet, but probably should.
Yeah, that leads to the possibility of an interesting project is being able to write a bash to Xonsh transpiler.
Yes. Yeah.
It seems like a hairy problem and one that I'm not likely to engage in, but if anybody else out there is interested, then I would definitely be interested in hearing about the outcome.
Yeah. We need to find some 16-year-old savant who has and give them a lot of Mountain Dew or something.
So it seems as though there could be some potential path or compatibility issues when moving between virtual environments and having access to extension modules loaded into Xonsh, and I'm wondering if you can shed some light on how that plays out.
When you go into a virtual environment, I'm not a super expert on virtual environments, actually, but when you go into a virtual environment, you get your own... You're basically making modifications to environment variables, is my understanding of how it works.
Yep.
And so that gets done, and those modifications happen when you source the activate file. Mm-hmm. And so since we have the capability of sourcing that file, virtual environments should work. And I guess your question is what happens, which version do you get when you import something then after that? Yeah, I think you would have to have, if you want the virtual env source, you would have to have, if you want the virtual environments extension to have been imported, you would have to start up Xonsh in that virtual env. I think that's the right answer.
Yeah, I was mainly curious about how that would work in terms of if you are using Xonsh and you have loaded some various different libraries into your shell environment, and then you go ahead and source a virtual env, whether those libraries that you've already loaded would still be accessible, or if there would be some contention issues if you have different versions of those libraries in your virtual env, or also even if you're using a different Python interpreter within that virtual environment. It's just an interesting problem to try and think about how that would actually all play out in terms of interoperability.
Yeah, so I mean, the answer there is that every time you start up Xonsh, you get your own... I mean, you're starting it up through a new Python interpreter, and so you get whichever Python interpreter your environment was told to use. And so if that's, 3.4, but in your virtual env it's 3.5, and you start up a Xonsh shell in a new virtual env, then you're going to get the 3.5 version, and then whatever imports you do. So it's all self-contained.
Okay.
It's like if you had started up Bash inside of one version of Bash inside of another version of Bash, right? They're different interpreters.
Certainly.
Yeah, each has its own Unix process context. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. Is even though it's all Python, the Unix process model keeps you from shooting yourself in the foot too horribly, because it's not like you're going to have different versions of Python sort of intermingling at the bytecode level because they're all running in their own process.
Right, exactly.
And that actually brings up another topic that we haven't covered yet, is that Xonsh is fully cross-platform, including Windows, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct. So, I mean, the way this all works, actually, is that we use it. Xonsh is completely. It's basically like it's 100% pure Python. There's no extension modules in there, and we only have one dependency currently, which is ply. And I've thought about bringing that in so that we only rely on the standard library. But the trick here is that you can use ply to, so you can build up a parser in ply that then produces a Python syntax tree, even for the subprocess interface. All that just becomes a Python syntax tree, and so you can get that and then compile it down to Python bytecode and roll from there. So it's actually very portable.
And speaking of dependencies and libraries that are being pulled in, I know that a little while back somebody added support for the prompt toolkit as a backend for the parser and the displaying, in place of high readline library. And I know that that's still a little bit rough around the edges, so I'm curious what the current state of the world is around that and any advice that you might have to people who are trying to use Prompt Toolkit as their main environment within Xonsh.
Yeah, so the Prompt Toolkit stuff has been really great. So anyone who's dealt with readline knows how awful it can be. And then Prompt Toolkit, to give people some background, is sort of a pure Python alternative to readline. I don't want to say it's a clone because I don't think it certainly doesn't implement the same interface, but I don't think it even really interacts with it in the same way. And so this was written by Prompt Toolkit was written by a gentleman, I believe, by the name of Jonathan
Slenders. Yep.
Yeah,
we had the pleasure of interviewing in a previous episode.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. He seems like a cool guy. So I had sort of put up on my this would be cool idea list that it would be cool to have an interface that used Prompt Toolkit, and a lady by the name of Anna worked on that, and then she got an internship at Facebook over the summer and didn't do much work on it after that, but might return to it. She's an undergrad CS person, I believe. So it was awesome that she put that in, and it was working and everything, and then sort of Prompt Toolkit keeps changing and evolving, and every time an issue comes up, I basically ping Jonathan and say, help, I don't, like, you're changing things, I don't know what to do. But it's cool. I mean, a lot of people ask for sort of a more fish-like interface, and so, if you're of an Aquarian persuasion, then that is what you want to be using. And especially if you're on Windows and Mac. Prompt Toolkit has sort of smoothed over a lot of the issues on Windows and Mac, because readline can be kind of hit or miss on those platforms.
And so one of the things that I've experienced in using both the PyReadline and the Prompt Toolkit backends is that some of the key handling, particularly for things like Control-Z and Control-D, are a little bit different between the two. Most specifically, in Prompt Toolkit, it appears that Control-Z just doesn't work at all, at least right now. So I'm just curious how the key handling comes into play within Xonsh, and also taking into account the two different backends that are available.
Yeah, so I mean, I believe that specific issue is a Prompt Toolkit one, but basically what ends up happening is that Xonsh has to sort of set things up in the right way when it's setting up whatever backend interface it wants to use. And so there's sort of two potential problems there. Are we setting it up correctly and in the same way across all backends? That should be a yes, but might not be. And then, are the backends actually doing what you think they should be doing? And I would say I've had no end of problems with readline in that department. And the Prompt Toolkit issues tend to get resolved, relatively quickly, because Jonathan I'll put in a pull request to Xonsh when it needs to happen. But other people can and dive into the code. It's actually not that much code there in either of those classes.
And so while we're on the subject of diving into code, I'm curious what your advice to anybody is who is interested in digging more into the internals of Xonsh.
Yeah, so it depends what you want to do. If you're really interested in the language and making language modifications, like there's certainly some room to grow there. And so looking at the lexer and parser files, lexer.py and parser.py, is probably where you'd go. I'm trying to be as liberal and generous as humanly possible for things like aliases. So if people want to create a really big suite of aliases and then put those in sort of the conch standard library of sorts, and by all means go to aliases.py and start writing things. If you want to deal with how the shells themselves work, there's a simple class hierarchy. So there's a base shell, and then there's the readline shell and the prompt toolkit shell on the same level, and then there's just a shell class that picks between them based on whatever user input was given. So, there's sort of those kinds of things, and then there's other capabilities, sort of the extras that make it worthwhile, like looking at the completer. We could have a better mechanism for doing completions from man pages. We've done a little bit of that, but not necessarily enough. And if you want to dive into the history, there's a history.py file, and you can kind of follow it from there. So, yeah.
Do you guys ever see yourselves at any point, if the prompt toolkit support evolves sufficiently, dropping readline entirely and switching to a one input model shop effectively for conch?
So I would say no. As much as I love the prompt toolkit, but that's only because I want conch to be available to be used effectively only on the standard library, right? So that's the only dependency. And the reason for that is because a lot of people are really concerned about portability. This is something that I sort of discovered after putting this out there, was that, some of the feedback that we were seeing on Reddit and Hacker News and places like that was that it's a cool idea, but no one will ever use it because Bash is everywhere. And so, while there are tools like Conda and pip and, getting into the package manager, like the distribution package managers is really important, to have that ability to just say, like, okay, here is Python, the Python standard library, and here is my one project, and I have a shell. And I think that's extremely valuable. So if Prompt Toolkit can make it into the standard library, then yes. And Prompt Toolkit probably should be in the standard library once it becomes more stable, I think.
Very cool. So do you have any suggestions for people who may not have the privileges to set their own login shell, but who want to try conch?
Yeah. So I would download and install Conda version for the Python 3, and then you can say you're forced to use something like Bash or Z shell. What you can do is, as I haven't tried this, so it might not work, but I'm pretty sure you can just, having installed conch into user space with Conda or, with setup.py install --user, you can then just have it conch run in your bash RC. I'm pretty sure that would work. Or you can just run it first thing, and then you're going to be immediately dropped into a conch environment.
And would that work better with just running conch as opposed to, say, execing? Like, I know in the past, some people, when they want to sort of break out of the shell they're forced to use, they'll exec the other shell, and then that becomes their shell. But because of all the capabilities that you guys have that sort of like peer and interface with Bash, does it actually make more sense to just run conch as a regular user space program as part of your regular Bash initialization?
I don't think it much matters whether you run it or exec it, because if you're going to use that foreign shell interface, the first thing Bash is going to do is, or the first thing conch is going to do is fire up another instance of whatever shell you told it to use, and then read in the data there. So you're you're going to have sort of 3 levels temporarily while you're starting up Conch. So you have bash and then Conch will start up another bash, and then it'll kill that.
Right. That makes sense. Thank you. My IT department has us using bash and bash it, which is kind of like supposed to be an oh my Xonsh kind of thing, but it has some frustrating aspects, and so I would love to try something else. This sounds great.
Yeah.
And so, speaking of permissions, one of the things that I've run into a couple of times while playing around with Xonsh is that when I was trying to execute a couple of commands, I was getting permissions issues that didn't seem like I should be getting. At this point, I can't remember exactly what they were, but I'm just curious how the Xonsh shell interfaces with the different permissions models in Unix.
So we don't do anything special there, but if you run into those issues, what I would love for people to do, and this is not necessarily come across in the pull request so far, or in the issues, but since we have this rich history model, what I'd really like for people to do is to submit issues with the attached history file, somewhere, so that could just be rerun, and it could figure out exactly what's there. And exactly what environment they were using. We just kind of rely on whatever Python does for our permissioning stuff. So,
okay.
If what Python knows about, we know about.
Yeah, I'm assuming that the issue came up at some point in the interaction with the subprocess, and I'll try grepping through my history files and see what I can find where I ran into the issue, so I can post that into the issue tracker for you. Awesome,
thanks. I really appreciate it.
And so, what are some of the most interesting uses of Xonsh that you've seen or done on your own?
Aaron Muir, who's going to soon be my employee, which is exciting. He's coming to South Carolina as a staff scientist. So at SciPy last year, we sat down and, he started just doing crazy stuff like putting a Unicode shell as his, in his prompt was one of the things that he did. And then another thing that he did within, I don't know, probably 20 minutes, was he uses max iterm2. And so he was able to just really quickly and simply pull images from Imgur and display them right in the shell. And it was probably 3 lines of code or something when all was said and done.
That's
so you
awesome.
got this scrolling image of scrolling images coming across the screen in Conch in 2 lines of code or 3 lines of code or something. So that was awesome.
And so, what does the future hold for the Xonsh project, and how can our audience help?
So there's a lot of things that we'd like to do. One is that we'd like to have native official Jupyter Notebook integration. So there's a pull request in right now that deals with that. But really, it needs people to bang on it, and there's some issues on Windows and things like that. So if anyone wants to help there, that'd be great. Being competitive with a lot of the nice features that other alternative shells have would be awesome. These are things that we're really in favor of. So, the big ones are man page completion, like in Fish. Z Shell has a couple of pretty interesting ideas in terms of, oh my Z Shell, and the way CD works in Z Shell is kind of cool, actually. It does sort of pattern matching on your current directory. And those kinds of extra features that don't exist right now. And just getting it out there and getting more people to use it and to bang on it. And of course the completion, having a full Python interface for writing your own completion routine so that you can write your own command, right? You could write an alias that might use argparse under the covers, and then you want Conch to be able to complete on that as well. And so that would be something that would be nice to do and nice to have an interface around. So I think those are the kind of the big things for now. You know, people kind of ask about legacy Python support, and I'm not personally interested in that. But if someone were to come along and rewrite the parser and lexer and make sure that everything works in Python 2.7, then I'd probably merge in the pull request because there's no reason not to. So, I mean, there's a lot of cool things that people could do, and I'm very open to contributions. So, and interacting with other tools in a nice way.
And when you say integration with the Jupyter project, I'm curious in what direction you're referring, because I know that there is a Xonsh kernel for the Jupyter notebook, but I'm assuming you're talking about it the other direction.
No, so yeah, I mean, so it is the kernel. So someone out there, or I think actually a couple different people at this point, have created their own kernel wrappers for Jupyter for Xonsh, but most of those relied on external infrastructure, like a meta kernel kind of thing, and they end up running in sort of, and that's just like an extra dependency layer that I don't want people to have to worry about. Ideally, if you have Jupyter installed and then you install Xonsh, you should just get the Jupyter kernel for Xonsh for free. It should be part of the Xonsh project without any external dependence.
Understood.
That's the pull request that we have in right now.
Okay.
That it would be really nice for people to bang on and give feedback.
And so before we move to the picks, are there any questions that we didn't ask that you think we should have, or anything that you wanted to mention?
No, I just wanted to thank you guys for having me on the show. It's really great.
Yeah, we appreciate you joining us. It's a very interesting project, and I've been having a lot of fun poking at it and playing around with it, and I definitely think that it's going to continue to be my default terminal, where I was using Xonsh for a while, but I think that this is going to take its place.
Awesome. Yeah, this is what I like to hear. So.
Okay, so with that, we will move on to the picks, and my first pick today is going to be the SQL Alchemy library and the Alembic migration library for it, because between the two of them, they just make interacting with databases so much more pleasant than a number of the other ORMs I've dealt with, particularly the migration capability, and being able to automatically generate migrations based on changes to the model files that you create is pretty amazing. And the work that Mike Bayer has done on that over the years is top-notch. My next pick is a movie called Mordecai with Johnny Depp, and it's just a really interesting, quirky movie that's got a bit of a different approach than a lot of other major movies that have come out recently. So I definitely enjoyed watching that. Definitely highly recommend that people check that out. And for my last pick today, I'm going to choose population.io. It's a website I came across recently that just has a interesting way of interacting with a lot of statistics around population. So you put in your birth date and it will say, you are the nth number of person alive today, and you are older than this number of people and younger than this number of people. And based on statistics in various countries, you can see what your average life expectancy is going to be and various other statistics of that sort. So it's just an interesting way of exploring that data. And with that, I will pass it on to you, Chris.
Thank you, sir. My picks today are science fiction themed because I had a science fiction themed weekend. The first pick is a book that I've been reading by Scottish science fiction author Ian Davis, I believe. I might be screwing up his last name. But in any case, he wrote this series of novels called the Culture novels, and they are really neat. They are vast in scope, and the culture is this expression of humanity where, as opposed to the most science fiction novels where technology has taken over and we are mere slaves to computers, this is absolutely not that at all. Our technology has indeed advanced to incredible extents, and we have created machines that are now autonomous beings unto themselves that are given personhood effectively. But humanity has not been reduced to this subservient role. It's a very symbiotic relationship, and humans are, do what we're good at. Basically, we use our intuition and our instinct and our cunning and problem solving in really sort of organic ways. And the humans and the machines work in a really interesting kind of partnership. And this is all sort of set against this really large, again, wide scope, intergalactic civilization. It's a really great novel. I'm only about 3/4 of the way through it, but I love it, and it's definitely pick worthy. My next pick is a movie, but it's a book movie combo. I know this is kind of mainstream, and you would have to live in a cave to not know about it, but I just saw The Martian yesterday with Matt Damon as the lead role, and I had read the book months ago and loved it to bits. And man, this is one of my favorite book adaptations from a science fiction novel into a movie. It's really faithful to the book. It's beautiful because it's a Ridley Scott film. The special effects are just gorgeous. The surface of Mars and it's a great story. It's accessible. It's the kind of thing you can take your parents or your kids or your, maybe not young kids, but your kids or your relatives to. It's a great story. I'm really pleased with what they did with it. They didn't skimp out on any of the technical aspects or the technological aspects. The main Matt Damon really lets his nerd flag fly freely, which I think is really kind of neat. So definitely 2 thumbs up on that one. And my last pick is also a movie setting the Wayback Machine for 1973. It is a French surrealist science fiction film called Fantastic Planet. And I was lucky enough to have my local art movie house here in Boston, the Brattle Theater, played it this Saturday evening at an 11:30 show. And it is such a wild ride. It defies description, but it is artful and creative and interesting and has a really surprisingly cogent plot and storyline for all of that. It's definitely worth digging up and seeing especially if you can find it on the big screen. Also highly recommended. It is in French with subtitles, but they're very readable. It's, and it definitely is one of those sort of mind blown kind of movies. And that's it for me. Anthony, what do you have for us?
So I think I'll just stick with probably my favorite book, which I read actually last year, but my brother just read it and finished it. He loves it. So the book's called The Worst Journey in the World. If you've never heard about it, it's sometimes said to be the greatest true adventure novel or story ever told, and it completely lives up to that. It's about the 1911 through 1914 Scott expedition to Antarctica, and it was written by Apsley Cherry Gerard, and it's an amazing story, and even more amazing that it's all true. So definitely check that out. And I think, I just wish for everyone who is affected by the flood here to stay safe and dry.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you coming on the show and joining us to talk about your work on the Xonsh project, and also just for everybody who's listening and hearing us pronouncing it different ways, if you could just care to explain the proper pronunciation or lack thereof.
So there is no proper pronunciation of Xonsh. That's part of the joke. It's one of these words that's kind of like a character from a Tolkien or George R. R. Martin book. You just don't know how to say it. So I often will say conch, but sometimes I'll say Xonsh, or the weirdest one I ever heard was Xionsh, which I don't even know how they got that, but have at, say it what you will. It's meant to be written.
And how did you come up with the name?
Okay. So there's obviously the shell, which is the physical animal, the snail, which is normally pronounced conch, but oftentimes in English it gets pronounced to conch, although that's much more modern. And then the So if you spell that out phonetically, you get, CONSH, and then the XO comes from, rather than the CO, comes from a text editor that I wrote about a year before I wrote the Xonsh shell. And so the text editor is called XO or XO frills, and it sort of comes from the same idea where what I want in my tools is for them to get out of the way and to not have a lot of frills or things that I wouldn't expect, and to just let me get straight to the code or my task at hand. So that's where the names comes from.
Great. All right. So for anybody who wants to keep in touch with you and follow what you are up to and what's up with the Xonsh project, how would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. So just go ahead and you can find us on. We have a mailing list at Google Groups. So it's conch@googlegroups.com. And then, so there's also the website, which is just conchxonsh.org. So you can visit us there. Or, you can, there's also an IRC channel that I'm not on as often as I should be, but other people are. And, you can find us on GitHub and, just send us an email or find me personally on Twitter. We don't have a Twitter account for the project or anything. So, yeah. And I'd really like to thank all the people who have helped out with the project so far. Particularly Adam Hartz came in and he just did a ton of work early on. We would be nowhere near at our capability level that we are now without him. And then Morton and Anna and Tobias and some other people have come in, and of course the users have been there giving us feedback and helping out. So yeah, let's and please, anyone who wants to help, you're more than welcome. We love/need contributors. So yep.
Well, thank you again, and I hope you are able to stay dry and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias. Thanks, Chris.